podcast for fundraising operations professionals.
Welcome to the Impact Unplugged podcast. We're your hosts for today's episode, Chelsea Lamago
and Haider Ali. Tune into the Impact Unplugged podcast, where we share advancement and nonprofit best practices and trends from industry experts.
Today on the show, we're joined by Jim Langley, president of Langley Innovations and trailblazer in the world of higher education advancement. With over 30 years of experience and a track record of successful fundraising campaigns at institutions like Georgetown, UC San Diego, and Georgia Tech, Jim's insights have shaped the strategies of hundreds of universities. Jim is the author of 5 influential books, including The Future of Fundraising, Adapting to New Philanthropic Realities, and a sought-after speaker renowned for his engaging seminars. Whether Jim is pioneering innovative donor engagement or redefining philanthropic strategies, he's consistently been at the forefront of change in higher education. Thanks for joining us today, Jim. Let's dive into your wealth of knowledge and experience.
Thank you, Chelsea.
So we all see your LinkedIn posts regularly, and I'm a big fan. And it's interesting because on calls regularly, folks will actually reference your posts as well. So there's no doubt that your LinkedIn presence is well known and regarded across the industry. And you provide folks with helpful insights and information, and sometimes those are even contrary to popular beliefs or traditional ways of thinking. I'd love for you to share with our listeners, what are some of the key events or aspects over your career that have shaped your thinking in the past?
Thank you, Chelsea. And I'd also like to say I appreciate being with you, and I very much appreciate your founding vision and the outlook and attitude of FundMinder and Miner. And I hope more and more people look into it, not just as a product or service, but the underpinning philosophy, I think, is incredibly important and very timely. I would say that when I think about what shaped me and continues to shape the content I share, I see 2 powerful factors. One, I began as a journalist, and like many people who came into advancement or fundraising, we came from some other place, didn't really see ourselves in that field, but somehow fell into it, usually because we believed in a cause or purpose, and then we accepted that as a part of our responsibility. But I began as a journalist, and before that, I studied history. And in both of those fields, you are taught and you learn the power of going to the source, primary sources. That if you really want to learn, if you really want to investigate, if you really want to unearth something of value, yes, it's good to talk to lots of people, but if you can get to the primary source and learn directly from an original document or an eyewitness or someone who was very much a part of what you're trying to describe, you get more insight. So the corollary for me was, when I came into the field and came into fundraising, I started on the communication side. But when I came into the fundraising part of it, my tendency was to go directly to donors as the primary source of giving, of philanthropy, to learn from them. And when I did, I started to see a disparity between what donors were sharing with me and, in some cases, what speakers were sharing at professional conferences or in professional literature. And it won't be surprised, we're all fall prey to this, is that ego gets into the testimony of fundraisers. I did, I raised, we set records. When you talk to donors, you hear a different testimony. I gave, I hope to achieve, I thought this was important. And I started to notice right from the beginning the gap between what organizations wanted from donors and what donors wanted from organizations. And I started to see that very early in my career. And then I started to speak up, not in a scolding way, but to say, if we listen more closely to donors, we will change our language, we will change our orientation, we will be more mindful of these characteristics. And as we are, we'll become more successful at fundraising. So I started to speak up and challenge little simple things like, well, did we raise it or did they give it? Do we acquire a donor? Look at this fellow. I just brought him in, just acquired him. Or did we get a name on a piece of paper and let that name sort of slip away from us because we thought we'd acquired a donor and we didn't start listening to that person who had just crossed our threshold. So I started listening to the language, again, as a reporter, as somebody steeped in language by virtue of my background, which includes having parents who began their careers as Shakespearean actors, who includes growing up hearing Shakespeare being rehearsed in the living room when I was going to sleep. So, I was very mindful of language, the meaning of language, and sort of saying, well, I think our language may be a little more boastful and a little less investigative than it needs to be, and a little less responsive and respectful of the donor than it could be. Not that anybody had ill intent, but you just fall into a kind of a shorthand that says, oh, we acquired, we build a pipeline. There's a wonderful one, build a pipeline. Just kick those donors out and push them into your pipeline. That's a wonderful concept. It's flawed. And the minute you start thinking that way, then your thinking is flawed. If you think about, what is it that we're attracting donors to? How are we creating conditions that make donors want to come in? And you start asking yourself, what are donors looking for? What motivates them? And how do we create those conditions so that they voluntarily come? And when they come in, they are rewarded, encouraged, want to give more of themselves, whether it's time, talent, or treasure. So that's a long answer to your very good question. But I would say those two factors, and I would love to sort of keep that paradigm in front of us as a field. The difference between what we want from donors and what donors want from us. In some cases, that gap is growing and it's worrisome.
I love learning that you have a communications background, Jim. Something that I think about all of the time is that donors are not giving to organizations to help them meet a dollar goal or fundraising goal.
Right.
They are giving the funding and donations in order to make an impact. And when they're giving those gifts and when we're sharing the stories with them of how they can make an impact when they give the gifts and when we're requesting that they support our organizations, I really like to think of that relationship as trust-based and based on promises. And since these donors are supporting impact, we have to be able to communicate that back to them and show them that we are delivering on those natural expectations that they have and that we've established as part of the relationship.
So important, Chelsea. And then in light of the fact that there is a significant and sustained erosion of trust in all institutions, in the public and private sector, this is one of the great symptoms of our era. I mean, historians may look back on this and talk about it as the era of eroding trust in institutions, or, this desire to find some new way to collaborate to achieve common goals. So you take something like the Edelman Trust Barometer and you watch it over the years, including higher education, down, down, down. And so to your point, Chelsea, I do think we need to be much more conscious of fundraising strategies and advancement strategies that are trust building. And one of the ways to think about that is what caused this erosion of trust and try to counter that.
This is such an interesting area. I think we're veering into because I think, Jim, you talked a little bit about how language shapes our thinking and our thinking shapes our actions. So, it made me think a little bit about even the language around how we organize ourselves. So you think about the Office of Advancement, and you've spent many years as a vice president at different institutions.
Yes.
There's the fundraising component or the alumni relations component. But you've also talked about advancement sort of being the guardians of credibility.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in that language of and both parts. Tell us a little bit about what you mean by being the guardians and what you mean by the credibility part.
Yeah. So I remember a point early in my career, very early in my higher education career, in which I was acting as a university spokesperson. And there was a difficult issue A new president came in. We had an interim vice president. And the advice that I was given was, here's how we'll get the press off our back. We'll say X, Y, or Z. As a former reporter, I knew it wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. And I knew a decent reporter would puncture holes in it. So I was, maybe 27, 28. And I pushed back and said, no, that will undermine our credibility. And once that happens, it'll take years to get it back. So we don't want a president to start this way. And they weren't ready for this, fresh-faced young person to push back in that way, because they kind of liked the phrasing that they had come up with. And I held my ground, even to the point of saying, I don't want to lose my credibility, then I'm no longer helpful to you, and certainly don't want the institution to lose its credibility, because this crisis will magnify and others will follow. And there will always be, are they telling us the truth? So there's a very tense moment as to whether my career would advance beyond that point. And the president eventually backed away and then came to have a high regard for me and became one of my great champions and door openers in my career. And so that's it. I mean, I don't know where that came from. I don't take personal credit for it, but it is protective, and it is the ability to think not just how do you get out of a situation, but how do you move forward? And credibility and trust are so important in every relationship, and to the point where I can't imagine why business schools don't teach that ethics are the best business. The more ethical your business is, the better the brand, and the better that brand will stand the test of time, and the stronger the community you will build around that brand. That trust is the glue, but ethics are the vehicle. So tell the truth, fess up when you screwed up, and protect that above and beyond all else. So then I brought that into advancement leadership, saying, we are the protectors of the credibility of the institution. Why? Because we have the most interaction through communication, through fundraising, through alumni relations, through constituent relations. We're the ones representing the university. And if we're just yes people and nod our head, when direction comes from on high, we don't serve ourselves well, we don't serve the field of advancement well, and we don't serve the institution well. So I would love to have, I'm so glad you brought this up, I'd love to have much more dialogue in our professional literature, in our professional conferences, about trust building and where credibility comes from and how it's protected, and how we all, as spokespersons, as representatives of colleges and universities, are in the business of protecting credibility, ours and the collective credibility of our brand.
So I love where this came from, because it kind of pulls again your journalistic background and being able to, I'd say, in some way challenge authority as well. One of the things that sticks out in terms of credibility is just kind of our ability to deliver on the promises that we make, because that's how you build trust, right?
Yes.
How would you characterize sort of our industry more broadly today on our ability to deliver on the promises we're making? How are we doing? How would you rate us?
Not well. And I think it's inadvertent. I don't mean to assail anyone's character. I think we just succumb to norms. That's how I describe it. We succumb to norms. And when norms get lower, we go, well, everybody's doing it, right? So for instance, in higher education, alumni participation has, in terms of the percentage of alumni giving back to their alma mater on a regular basis, has declined for 38 straight years. And so people go, well, yeah, we're down to 6% alumni participation, but that's the norm for publics. It drives me batty. Is that how little you think of yourself, as to say, I just want to be at the norm? Is that how American higher education got to be the envy of the world, by just saying, well, as long as we fit within the norm, as long as we're sinking with the same ship, isn't it wonderful, right? I mean, come on.
There's
So
a
it's
difference
terrifying to me, right?
between what everyone else is doing and what the right thing
Yeah.
to do is.
Chelsea, isn't that teenage stuff? And I know, Hader, you have babies at home, but when they get to be teenagers, you're going to say you don't want to be like everybody else. That's not what we're going to do in this family, right?
It's fun. I was been reading this a while, but mediocrity is just as contagious
Oh,
as success. And so
exactly
if
right.
mediocrity becomes the norm, like you just mentioned, it becomes the expected behavior, and
Exactly.
people, to Chelsea's point, will do just that. So let me shift towards in a different direction then. So if that's the slide, and you mentioned 38 years, that's a long, prolonged sort of slow, steady slide down. Um, you know, what is preventing us, or what's in place that's preventing us from turning that into an uptick? What are the causes behind why we're unable to deliver on our missions, or what is the cause in terms of is it incentives, is it leadership, is it a lack of resources and technology? What's behind this slide?
Yeah.
My sense is the underlying issue is fear, in the sense that to break out of a pack, to question norms, takes some courage, because you'll get scuffed up and questioned and challenged along the way. And so we have moved, I believe, from an ethic of principle to an ethic of popularity, probably in the last 30 or 40 years. We were more comfortable with principles at one point because we were rooted more strongly in community, in faith, and long relationships. Again, I'm not faulting anyone, but disruptive things happen. And an ethic of popularity. And so I saw that growing up as a baby boomer. It seemed like the most important thing to do was to be popular, to fit in. And that's fine when you're a teenager. It's very understandable, but you should start outgrowing that in your 20s, right? And you should, even in terms of your own growth and development, should individuate. This is an important psychological term, which means I am an individual and I will embrace myself, quirks and all, and be comfortable with that, and be comfortable in my skin and project that. Well, here's who I am. Not defending myself, but here's who I am. And so, for instance, higher education is sadly and profoundly imitative. Why? Oh, we want to be just like X. Now, again, you're raising your children. No, you don't want to be just like Joe or Susan. You want to be you, right? If you're doing a good job. But look at this imitation, our peers and our aspirational peers, and all this benchmarking. I keep saying, but don't you want to be yourself? You have a unique history. You have a unique place. Right? Don't you want to be yourself? And where I've seen real success, for instance, at UC San Diego, that shot out of nowhere, there was a different sense of seeking individuality, of seeking uniqueness, of being content with being a new university, a disruptor, challenging norms. And they prospered as a result of doing that, of saying, no, we don't want to follow the same path. I can even remember when they were looking at a new business school, the real concern from within the organization was, why would we park ourselves in the shadows of the well-established business schools? Why would we park ourselves in the shadow of Sloan, you go on and name your favorite big schools, Harvard, a business school. Why would we do that? So there was this real effort to differentiate or not do it at all. I wish more people would follow the UC San Diego, the Arizona State model way of thinking, because if you've noticed, those are the ascendant universities right now. And the great ones will hold their own because they have this sort of multi-generational root system, but that will be challenged, as we saw with the controversy around Israel-Palestinian issues, right? Even the great institutions get shaken at the core by new realities. So my favorite quote, perhaps of all time, comes from John Kenneth Galbraith, who said, "The revolution is the kicking down of an already rotted door." And what I see is we, by succumbing to norms, by wanting to fit in with the pack, by wanting to be like fancy University X, we don't see this as kind of rots our ambition, our clear thinking, our courage. And therefore, we don't see things coming. And then when they come suddenly and hit us hard, we say it's a revolution. I would say American higher education will face revolutionary consequences in the next 10 years, but they've been 40 years in the making.
Jim, your commitment to questioning norms, being courageous, sticking to ethics, trust building, protecting credibility in relationships, it's also impressive. And it really should be the base standard in higher education today. And it's certainly, I think, what our donors would expect of us as well.
Yes, yes,
And speaking of donors and shifting the conversation a bit from industry to our donors,
yes.
we constantly hear that organizations are saying acquiring new donors is getting more and more difficult. Curious to hear your interpretation of that. Is it more competition? Are there more organizations and choices? Are there other factors at play here?
Sure. Yeah, and it is. And of course, we want to challenge that phrase that you're not acquiring them and there isn't a pipeline. And that's part of the problem, is that you're assuming so much that if you keep doing what's been done for the last few decades, they will come your way. And what you didn't realize is when you thought you were acquiring them or you're building a pipeline, you were giving yourself much too much credit. But to answer your question, one, there is a shrinkage of giving households in the US, in Canada, and by the way, in all Western democracies where philanthropy is a hallmark of those cultures. And it has to do with the erosion of trust that you spoke of before. So we say they're not giving to us anymore. And then, why aren't these people as beneficent and generous as they once were? Whoop, 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 whoop. You see, they're not giving to us, therefore they're not generous. No, they're just expressing that generosity in different ways, including going off the institutional grid. So, for instance, we've seen a lot of grandparents put their children through college, grandparents, because they say, my children didn't have the same economic advantages I had. They stopped giving to colleges and universities and other organizations, but you see they're still doing something profoundly philanthropic.
Right.
And Kevin L. Brown, who I follow on LinkedIn and quite like, has pointed to these remittance payments as being profoundly philanthropic. These are payments going from people of very modest means back home, whether that would be Central America, wherever, right? So there's lots of philanthropy going on, even among desperately poor people. It's often
That we're just not
more
capturing.
dramatic among desperately poor people, right? Or people of limited means. So philanthropy hasn't gone away, but giving to institutions has. We don't trust them. So fewer. And then, Chelsea, there is a shift in the attitudes and behaviors of the donors that remain institutional supporters. And I would say this is driven largely by the upsweep of entrepreneurialism. So when I began my career, a lot of the people that we would have worked with either had inherited wealth of many generations or corporate wealth. Right? They were employees of large corporations. When the entrepreneurs came onto the scenes, people who'd created their own company or two or three companies, they took the lessons of entrepreneurship and applied them to philanthropy. Where's the big idea? Where's the bold, forward-looking concept? What are you doing to fill a gap in the marketplace? Where's the business plan? Where's the budget? Where's the due diligence, right? And all of a sudden, you have these donors questioning you more rigorously than ever before. And we got a little huffy about that. We didn't have to do this before. But if we stand up to that scrutiny, that due diligence, there's very significant support awaiting us, right? So I would say the rise of the entrepreneur has created a kind of a tough-mindedness in giving and a desire to even look across institutions to say, now I care about sustainability, or I care about at-risk teenagers, or I care about, pick your issue. And they're looking across institutions and saying, I want to incent those that do it well. So the shrinkage of the loyalist, the subsidizer, you tell me what you need and I'll give, they're still there, but they're aging. And the rise of this targeted investor, that's what we're seeing.
Yes,
So,
we're seeing a hater, and I talk about this often.
Yeah.
I see him smiling, but the birth of the investor donor.
Yes, exactly right. And stop talking about giving and start talking about philanthropic partnerships and the alignment of interests. Start thinking that these are alliances and
And
alignments, not single gifts. And
when you
just turning that corner is immensely helpful.
when you think about philanthropy too, I mean, you can still have philanthropic outcomes and it be a philanthropic gift. And
Yes.
I think that's also something really interesting to think about because I think that there's another school of thought where you should just be giving unrestricted gifts and supporting the organization's mission. And there's definitely an important place in the ecosystem and market for that. But I think also that you can still have impact outcomes and it be very much so philanthropic purpose.
Oh, absolutely right. And that's in fact how we should be thinking, as that philanthropy is this corridor for impact. It was imputed to organizations. They're doing good things. Therefore, if I give what they want, they will do more good
Yeah.
things. That even among traditionalists is being increasingly challenged. More and more of the traditionalists saying, I'm not sure I've made a difference. And before you come back to me, could I have a little bit more clarity about what you're doing with the money this time? And I think I wrote this yesterday or the day before. To the extent you are seeing unrestricted giving, it's coming from loyalists of many, many years, often in the form of estate gifts. So I say, unrestricted giving isn't something you pitch, it's something you earn
Yeah.
by doing what we've been talking about, trust building.
I think the idea is almost the unrestricted gift is the pinnacle of demonstrating trust, right? You've reached the point where you are so bought into the ability of that organization to steward your legacy in effect, because it in so many cases, like you said, it's an estate gift. I think that's such an important point, and it kind of emphasizes the corollary between trust and being a repeat donor.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit then about, like, what is the importance of repeat donors, and retaining your donors, and how do we encourage people to look at those for long-term fundraising success rather than just I got my campaign or I got my goal.
Yes. So people often ask me, what are the new metrics, Jim? You challenge some of the old tactical metrics. What are the new metrics? And I'm going to start with a commitment to doing all that we can to preserve and enhance the lifelong value of a donor. Because when you start looking at the lifelong giving, when you look at success, people who have given to an institution over 30, 40, 50 years, you see that when that happens, they give more as their means increase. So that donor who gives $1 million or more, when you look at that history, traditional history in higher education, given 17 years previously before they give the $1 million gift, right? When you look at the person who gives a very significant portion of their estate, you see on average that they've given for 20 years or more. That's the most productive source of estate giving. So there's this big duh in there that when you retain a donor over time and you just don't obsess about the gift, and you really think about sustaining the relationships, which may mean you back off occasionally when they're going through difficulty or selling a business, or and you try to make the giving more rewarding, you clearly see how it outstrips tactical fundraising. I mean, it isn't even close. So this notion of what we're going to sacrifice something by committing to the long run is absurd on the face of it, because there's overriding data that says no. And oh, by the way, the people who are saying we can't afford to think long term are now in a situation where the norm, got back to that wonderful word, the norm, is the loss of 4 out of 5 first-time donors. And you're worried about making a commitment to the long term when you've got a sieve that you're calling fundraising, right? Get a gift, but lose a donor. And I think about the shrinkage of donors. You can't afford to lose donors anymore. So you've got to commit to the long term as your most productive and most sustainable long-term fundraising strategy. And then when you start listening to donors, to just keep reinforcing the themes here, our research and the research of others says when you ask donors, about their giving experience, what do you hear? I feel more than adequately thanked. In fact, a little embarrassed by it, but underinformed about the impact of my giving. Am I making a difference? And then to peel it away a little deeper, because I have this tendency to get to the deeper psychological motivations, what I've crystallized is saying what donors are really looking for in the core, serious donors, people who will give over their lifetime, is to believe in an organization, purpose greater than themselves, but believe that the organization is delivering on its mission promise, to belong and to be in a community of kindred spirits where we're working on something together, which is one of the great joys of life, working with like-minded people to go after something meaningful. And finally, believe, belong, and the one is to make something better. And I frequently, just to show people that I am more than open to the minds of young people, I frequently cite a 21-year-old who says, quite brilliantly, the purpose of civic engagement is to improve ourselves as we improve our community. Isn't that brilliant for 21?
I love
That was
that.
Benjamin Franklin in about 1735, who is credited with creating the first civic organization.
I really love that you brought up this notion of creating something together. And there was
Yes.
this Harvard Business Review article I read years ago that has stuck with me and I think about all the time. And it really talked about how one of the best ways to build trust and relationships is through creating together.
Oh,
And so I love the notion of creating impact together and there's no better way to create this affinity and sense of community than being able to change lives and make
yes,
impact together. And to sort of close the loop there and solidify that messaging and communicate that to donors, it's really in the form of these creative communication methods that the institutions and organizations need to prioritize to get that information back to their donors at scale across so many
absolutely.
different programs and purposes and initiatives.
Right.
It's no small feat, but it's certainly worth prioritizing.
Absolutely. And I think this is what donors are missing and wanting, whatever they
Yeah.
call it, is where is this co-creation process? Shouldn't we be working on these things together? Am I reduced to a single dimension of a giver when there's so much more I'd like to be involved in, particularly if we have a passion for a cause or a purpose, right? So I think the best cases for support going forward will be crowdsourced and co-created. So, just to give you a really quick example, um, I'm a veteran. I maintain an interest in helping veterans. So if my alma mater says to me, wouldn't you like to give? Well, maybe, but I'm trying to be involved in the causes that I care most about. It's not the only one, but it's an important one, I think. But imagine, rather than saying, do you want to give to your alma mater, to say, Jim, we saw you were a veteran. You went to school on a GI Bill. Would you like to come in with other veterans, look at what young veterans are experiencing today on campus and help us create more encouragement, more support, and better pathways forward? I promise you we will give optimally to that which allowed us to bring our experience to bear in helping current and emerging generations. There's no doubt. And we've seen it over and over again when we create these co-creation environments on behalf of clients. It's the panel that reviews the proposal that gives the most to the project. So you don't really need the pitch. You need to create the conditions for doing what you just said, Chelsea.
Yeah, I love that.
Create the conditions where we can work.
It's a really important point, because I think campaigns and institutions, they're about charting a vision for the future, much like leadership is. And I think you've mentioned this too. And I'm sitting in the room with two CEOs right now, so I can say what good leaders do is actually they create the environment. They
Yeah.
don't create
Yes.
the actual plan. They don't necessarily create the actual product. They
Yes.
create the environment where those people can
Yes.
thrive. And I think that's what good institutions should be doing as well.
It's
Yeah.
very well said.
It kind of goes back to the notion of it's going back to taking it simple here again. It's an art and a science, and there's so much in both of those things. Hader, you mentioned the future and kind of continuing on that path with all of Jim's amazing insights. I'd love for you, Jim, to share with our listeners how they can think about moving in some of the directions we talked about today. And I know you shared so many amazing insights, but maybe
Yeah.
there are some key trends that are top of
Yeah.
mind in 2025.
Yeah. So, given all the things we've said now, what we want to do is husband the resources we have. We want to deepen the donor experience. We want to create these stronger communities of shared purpose. Think about those, but then say, okay, how? Before you go into your next fundraising season or your next fundraising campaign, here's some very simple things you can do. Commit to conducting annual stewardship interviews for your top tier donors, whether that's your top 25 or your top 100. Just announce, as a matter of policy going forward, we are going to block out time every year to sit down with our top donors and say, how are we doing? How's the relationship? What are we missing? Proactively, we're going to go after you and explore how satisfying this relationship is. And for those that you don't have the time and resources to interact with interpersonally, you can do donor satisfaction surveys. So think about rather than the next campaign and the next blah case for support and the next giving pyramid, which never does prove to be true about anyone's giving that formula that's like a bald tire about ready to burst. How about we just commit ourselves to conversation and commit ourselves to a collective conversation? So no, advancement, it isn't your job to do all these interviews. What can the board do? What can the executive team do? What can the deans do, right? We're going to listen and we're going to say, and we're talking to presidents and leaders about this, we're going to commit to a culture of stewardship. We're going to say that this is an ethic that we're adopting. And that ethic can be made real through policies and practices like anyone who receives private support has signature authority on on private support is now a steward of that. Just don't say advancement, you do that. So you've been given a gift to, do X, Y, or Z. You are now the steward of it. Yes, advancement will help you prepare, but you have an obligation back to that donor. Just that simple announcement, that commitment will make a difference. Then starting to listen every year and commit yourself to an annual cycle creates a new benchmark. Here's the baseline of donor satisfaction in 2025. Now let's see if it's rising or falling. You see, then we get past John Kenneth Galbraith's injunction that this rot occurs because we've created a benchmark, baseline and benchmark. And what was donor satisfaction in 2025 versus 2026? And this could include first-time donors or whatnot, right? So all of a sudden you switch this framework from gift getting to the husbanding of the resources that you have, and in doing so in a way that's caring and loving and saying, we can't take these people for granted. Many of them are like living endowments, right? Even though they've given modestly, they've given over and over again. So first, as we said, you switch the attitude, the mindset, and then you put out practical manifestations of that. Your donors start saying or even bragging, which they do in their own circle. Well, my university schedules an interview with me every year, and I talk to the president, the chairman of the board, or whatever, right? Because right, they come to me and say, "You are an important stakeholder." And then what you'll also discover is a lot of those people go, "Well, I don't need that interview. Everything is fine." But you accomplished your purpose by saying,
Yeah.
we right now. Contrast that to what I see so often. Is you decide to go into the next campaign and you decide who your top donors are because they've always been your top donors and you really haven't paid that much attention to them. And then you employ someone to go out and put the case for support in front of them. And the consultant comes back going, well, they're not exactly thrilled. They're sort of saying they're not sure how the gift was expended the last time. They haven't heard that much. They're dissatisfied with the communication. They're starting to feel like an ATM. This is what we pick up on all the time. And so why do you have to hire a consultant to help you listen? In a good relationship, would Hader hire me to listen to his wife? I don't think that would work real well, right? I think we need to teach Hader how to do that directly, right? But I find this funny what they ask consultants to do. Go listen. Well, we understand objectivity, we understand candor, but our job is ultimately to say, yeah, we'll listen now, but we've got to show you how to incorporate
Right.
this
Going
in
forward.
regular practice. And you can still use a consultant like to do a survey, a donor
Yeah.
satisfaction survey, but you see they're a conduit. They're listening for you and they're gathering candid information, but you've made the commitment to listen, right? And they're just facilitating.
I really also love that you made the recommendation for folks to kind of start somewhere, establish a baseline and a benchmark, and work on it from there. Um, and one thing that I hear often from folks that we talk to regularly is that they struggle to sort of garner this leadership or non leadership institution wide support for stewarding donors, for making sure that funds are spent, for making sure that funds are spent on the right things and in a timely manner. And so I know that's a hefty topic all in itself, but if you have some high level recommendations for our listeners on how to maybe approach the culture of stewardship across the organization and garner that buy in from leadership and from all the different departments involved, would really love to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, we do see kind of a misweighting given changing philanthropic circumstances. We see a misweighting in most advancement operations, and they're overweighted in our estimation in terms of fundraisers. And so you move into a campaign, and so you got these people out trying to make connection, but relationships need to be repaired, right? That would be a great job for stewardship, but stewardship is so lean that it can't rise to it. More and more people want you to speak to them and their values. So get out of ad speak and get into more customized conversations. That means you need more writers, but we have one writer who's trying to do 18,000 things, right? So we say, well, watch this work pour into your organization, and the workflow and where you start to feel pressure will tell you what the organization looks like. And so often is that you need more in research so that you can better understand not just the classic kind of donor profile, but research into donor attitudes, and then more psychological insight into donor, more consistency in building donor profiles. So you need more sophisticated, more strategic research. You need much stronger stewardship so that there's receptivity to future requests. And you need more customized writing that is and storytelling that's rooted in listening. So it's part writing and part market research. Those are the pressure points that we're seeing in organizations, and that's where many fundraisers feel stranded. They're pushed out there, and they say things like, when we listen to them, they're struggling to get the first appointment. Well, what would help you get the first appointment? More major gift worthy ideas.
I love that.
Oh, right? So, what do they have? Here's what they have: strategic pillars. I'm calling those the wonders of the ancient philanthropic world. Strategic pillars. Yeah, pillars are what we associate with ruins, right? And what people want are something that's much more relevant and full of life, not pillars. I don't give to a pillar. Did you ever give to support a pillar? So what people want are specifics, actions, notion. Who can I help? How can I help them? They want projects. They want initiatives. They want clarity about who's being helped. And they're not buying the buckets or the pillars anymore, right? So,
Community and co-creating.
right, there we go. Right back to your point. So you got to populate those big, broad themes with specific impact scenarios. And this is hard, Chelsea and Hader. This is not where a lot of colleges and universities may be as gifted as they are. And this is where we're spending more and more of our time, is helping them generate major gift worthy ideas by listening to their donors, listening to their content champions, and trying to create this synthesis between the two. And we're doing that in the form of concept papers, marked draft, which can be tested with potential sources of support, if not co-created.
I love that we've come full circle back to language
Yes.
and how we started out. You mentioned things like pillars being aligned to the ruins, and gift pyramids. And there's only one place where we see pyramids on Earth now,
Right.
and they're ancient, but we still use them in our everyday life,
Right.
in advancement. I think the other word that comes to mind is actually, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, on the word stewardship. It's a very passive, potentially, sort of way of dealing with impact, whereas you see in for-profit areas, they've shifted to customer success.
Yeah.
How can we make this a success? How
Yeah.
can we make it impactful? How can we make your relationship as valuable as possible? And I want to pick your brain for a second and say, what do you think about having a donor success role, or stewardship becoming the donor impact role?
Yeah. I think it's excellent. I haven't used that phrase, but I like it a lot, or that notion. I like it a lot because what I keep talking about is the donor experience and doing things that money can't buy. I keep chiding people saying, why are you taking them out to dinner? They can buy a better dinner than you can, or buying a bottle of wine. They can buy a much, right? You're like trying to compete for their entertainment time, but you're not very good at it. But what about doing what money can't buy? And you got so much there in terms of shaping the future, of turning around lives, of creating new knowledge that will inform new industry and new healthcare practices. Where is that? But they'll go back, sorry to say it, to the same consultants who come up with the same language and the same concepts, and your major gift and your frontline staff are going, this is not what people want, right? So think about just what you said is, how can we do more brainstorming around what money can't buy? And think of the irony that you will raise a whole lot more money
Right.
when you provide what money can't buy.
What a good notion.
Yeah,
Love
right?
that.
Amazing.
Think about when donors came alive, and what we saw. I remember the injunction of a tough donor who was dissatisfied with one of the institutions I represented and took a long time to get to him. And then he gave me like a 10-minute meeting in the morning. I said, what's it going to take to earn your support? He said, bring your CEO up here. He was in New York City 3 or 4 times a year. Put me around the table with 3 or 4 other CEOs I can respect, and tell us the God's honest truth about what's working and what isn't. And in that process, you will earn my support. That's what I mean about creating the conditions. The other thing that we've touched upon, but we haven't said, is in our test, in our listening sessions, people want straight talk. They're tired of ad speak. They're tired of hyperbole. They want straight talk. They want journalistic tone. Just sit us down and tell us what's working and what isn't working, and how we, right? Isn't this how we all solve problems? Not by going, everything's fine and everything's great. What is with that stuff, right? So there we are. It's authenticity, and it's interpersonal problem solving. And why is this now so hard for us to grasp? How did we get so far away from what strikes you as just commonsensically true?
I like to think about this sort of simple idea that donors are people too. And of course, they expect those authentic interactions in the way that we do in our everyday lives. And they expect that we do what we say we're going to do. They expect open lines of communication. Like they're people too. And so if we kind of just think about sometimes putting ourselves in their shoes and what you would expect in these scenarios, it's simpler than we sometimes make it out to be. And it's so interesting that so many wonderful themes have emerged from this conversation around communication and authenticity and being courageous and challenging norms. I could go on and on, I think, with the list there. But Jim, thank you so much for sharing your expert insights and perspective today. We really can't thank you enough. I think this podcast could be multiple episodes long because it's so awesome getting to chat with you. If other folks and our listeners want to get in touch with you, where's a good place that they can find you?
I would direct them, if they could, to go to langleyinnovations.com, and also to direct them to the section that allows them to sign up for our newsletter, which I'm producing now every week, and really trying to deal with these issues in longer form. I continue to post on LinkedIn. You can also join me there and join conversations there. And I've created a newsletter just to answer questions that are commonly posed to me in greater detail than I can on LinkedIn. So, I'll go to 1,200 words as opposed to 500 words. So they're not long-winded, but we're trying to listen. And so anyway, you want to join this conversation, and I would say the conversation we've had is representative of best practice. So anyway, you can join this conversation, and I really appreciate the tone and style that you're bringing to your work, Chelsea and Hayder, and I hope more people will join your conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate the kind words. And do recommend all of your resources to our listeners out there. As I mentioned, we certainly find them very informative and valuable, and I hear from folks in the industry all of the time referencing them. So thank you again, Jim, and to our listeners, thank you all for tuning in. Keep an eye out for more episodes of Impact Unplugged to hear more insights from experts like Jim.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. Remember, if you want great content and insights, you can always visit our website at fundminder.com, subscribe to our newsletter as well, and follow us on LinkedIn, where oftentimes you'll find us interacting with Jim's posts and some of our own as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you again, Jim.
My pleasure.